Welcome, everybody. We will get started in just a second with our conversation with Congressman John Curtis about climate solutions. Just wanted to welcome everyone to join us for this wonderful virtual conversation. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Josh Kraft with Utah Clean Energy. I will be our host and our guide on the chat today. And I'll turn it over to Sarah Wright in just one more minute to give an introduction to David Bywater, who's moderating our discussion today, and to the Congressman. Just a reminder to folks, we are recording this, and also this is a meeting rather than a webinar. We'd love to see everyone's faces. Just to if you would be so kind as to put yourself on mute when you're not speaking, and we'll try to give some time for question and answer at the end, and we'll allow people to ask questions at that time. And we'll give it just another minute, Sarah, and then we'll kick it off.
Yeah, Josh, and given time, why don't I just kick it off, because the important part will be Congressman Curtis and David Bywater. So we'll go from there. I want to reiterate Josh's gratitude for everyone joining us today, and to Congressman John Curtis for being part of this. We're really pleased, and I'm excited to hear about his work on climate solutions and his leadership with the Conservative Climate Caucus and the Bipartisan House Storage Caucus. And when I think back, it's been about a year ago, and I'm really proud that he helped launch the Utah Climate and Clean Air Compact. And Congressman Curtis was an inaugural signatory. And we continue to work with our leaders. We have meetings at least quarterly to have discussions or educational briefings, such as the one we're having today. And we have the Utah Climate and Clean Air Caucus has an amazing group of leaders from business, government, nonprofit, and faith communities. And if you're not yet a signatory and you would like more information, please follow up with my colleague Josh, who you just met. His email and a link to the Compact website will be in the chat. And as Josh mentioned, just please keep yourself on mute, as we are being recorded unless you're speaking. And Congressman Curtis has kindly agreed to stay for some questions. So please put your questions into the chat, and my colleague Josh will be monitoring the chat, and as time allows, he will invite you to ask your question directly. So now I'm going to hand things over to David Bywater with Vivint. He's a longtime friend and an inaugural Climate and Clean Air Compact signatory. He's the CEO of Vivint, and among many other endeavors, previously, David served as the CEO of Utah-based rooftop solar company, Vivint Solar. And David successfully led Vivint Solar's growth across the nation, which led to the acquisition by Sunrun in a deal worth $5.4 billion. So this is not only a testament to David's skills, but also to the importance of the clean energy industry. So thank you so much, David, for moderating this discussion with Congressman Curtis. And I turn it to you.
Thanks, Sarah, and welcome, Congressman Curtis. So none of us need an introduction by the Congressman, but I'll do it nonetheless. Congressman Curtis represents the 3rd Congressional District since 2017. He's worked on a number of really important issues that are dear to my heart, including energy and climate, public lands, and supporting small businesses, as well as some really important work around combating human trafficking. So we appreciate all he's done for our state and for these important topics. He founded a Conservative Climate Caucus in June of this year to foster education on energy and innovative issues within House Republicans. Prior to this time in Congress, Congressman Curtis served as the mayor of Provo. For me personally, we've interacted quite a bit, both when he was in the mayor office, as well as his time as a congressman. He has been a great advocate for the work that I was doing at Vivint Solar. I have found him to be an incredible person who listens, who seeks to see insight from different point of views, and have the courage to do some pretty important things. So I'm very proud to be on this podcast this meeting with him today. So as as a business leader and as a Republican, I'm so pleased to see what the Congressman has been doing to step up to talk about climate issues and the opportunities in clean energy and reducing emissions in Congress. This isn't always the most safe place to be politically, but in Utah, this has a major role, and Congressman Curtis is playing that role. And in my view, in forging what I think is a very pragmatic path forward around energy and environmental policy. So with that, I want to start off our conversation today by giving Congressman Curtis some time to talk about what he's been doing with the Conservative Climate Caucus. So if you would, you've been very outspoken on the need for Republicans in Congress to engage in climate solutions. And now you've really taken this important step forward with the founding of this caucus in Congress. Could you tell us a bit more about the caucus and how we specifically might be a resource to you as you work with your Republican colleagues?
Excellent. Thanks, David. Thanks for your friendship, and Sarah and Josh, and to all of you. Hello from Washington, D.C. And it's a delight to take a little slice away from my life in D.C. and spend it with all of you. And it's good therapy for me to spend some time with you today. Thank you. Well, David, I left being the mayor of Provo 4 years ago, almost exactly 4 years ago. And at the time, I thought I understood how to be a good environmental steward. In Utah, everybody, as you all know, is very concerned about clean air. I arrived in Congress and found out how much I didn't know, especially about global warming and carbon and so many things that we talk about at great length here. And I found myself very unprepared to talk about these subjects, very uneducated, and quite frankly, if I'm honest, afraid to talk about climate. And many Republicans, most of my colleagues back here, have been on the sidelines. And when we're on the sidelines, two things happen. One, we send this image that we don't care about the environment, which is simply not true. And we also send the message that we deny the science, which is also not true. So in an effort to pull Republicans together, most people don't know this, but last February, I invited Republican members of Congress to Utah to come talk about the environment. And besides being told I was crazy, that Republicans wouldn't come to Utah to talk about climate, my staff said, listen, if you get 5 or 6 there, it's going to be a wild success. Imagine this, last February, 24 members of Congress, Republican members of Congress, traveled to Utah to join me in a conversation about the climate. It was really exciting. These were not ordinary members of Congress. 6 of them were what we call ranking members over the committees of jurisdiction over climate. It was a very successful 2-day discussion. That then led to a further effort to unite Republicans, and we founded the Conservative Climate Caucus. Once again, my staff said, hey, let's see if we can get a couple dozen Republicans to join this caucus. The day that we announced the caucus, we had 30 members. Within 2 weeks, 70 Republican members had signed up to be part of this. Today, we have about 76 members. That's a third of all Republicans in the House of Representatives have joined this caucus. The first tenet of the caucus is that the climate's changing and that man's influencing it. Now, imagine that, a third of Republicans stepped up to put their name behind that. David, it's a changing day, right? Republicans have realized, I think, here in Congress that it's been a mistake to not engage. When we don't engage, it leaves these impressions that are not good. And by the way, I found out you don't have to leave your conservative credentials at the door to have a lot of good ideas and to be part of the conversation. So it's been very rewarding, very exciting. The purpose of the caucus primarily is to educate members, to get their climate feet underneath them and get them comfortable talking about climate and tackling these issues.
And Congressman, why do you think there has been this reservation? Because, I remember the first time you and I spoke, I had shared with you a litany of surveys that 8 or 9 out of 10 Americans favor the advancement of clean energy. This is about as close to motherhood and apple pie as you can get. And I remember asking you, this just seems to be on the right side of history, and especially the younger generation, the younger voting generation, and the influencers. They feel like this is an important thing, and typically I found the Republicans to hopefully be more pragmatic in finding the genius of the end, where recognizing there's a need, there's actually support, and then finding pragmatic solutions to go find things that are pro-business and pro-environment, because there definitely is a rich, fertile ground for that to happen. So what have you learned from your colleagues on why the hesitancy, and as you're trying to go through this educational process and exploratory process, what are some of the things that they're discovering that might change and give you more momentum as you move forward to find pragmatic solutions?
David, I actually have a really strong opinion on this. I'm glad you asked. And I'm going to use an analogy, and I hope I don't offend anybody with the analogy, but I think it helps you see the answer to your question. Let's suppose hypothetically this was a conversation about immigration with this group of people. And I said, listen, before I'm willing to talk about immigration, I want every single one of you to acknowledge that the wall is good for immigration, right? So immediately, right, your chest tightens up, right, and you break out in a sweat. And the reason for that is the word "the wall" goes far beyond a physical wall. It encompasses a whole agenda of President Trump, right, that comes to mind when I say the word wall. And the reality of it is, for Republicans, the word climate does the exact same thing in a different way. When you use the word climate to many Republicans, it goes far beyond the word, and you hear that all you hear is the Green New Deal. All you hear is extreme ideas, right? All you hear is let's cut the head off to fix the headache. And so Republicans have repelled that, and they've moved away. They don't like that, and they won't engage in it. And part of my mission is to teach them, listen, here's a huge problem. The moment you're turned off and don't engage, nobody will listen to you anymore with your ideas and your suggestions. It's become a litmus test. We may not have acknowledged, but that question about is the climate changing and is man influencing is a litmus test. And if you can't get past that litmus test, you don't get a seat at the table. And Republicans need to acknowledge that. And just the question is not that hard, right? Is the climate changing? Of course it is. Is it possible? Is it just at all possible that decades and decades and decades of an industrial revolution has had an impact on it? Of course it's possible, right? Okay, now we're past that. Let's answer the question, what do we do about it? And for Republicans, they just have a hard time getting past that. So I'm trying desperately to help them understand, look, it's not that hard of a question, answer it, and then you can move on and have some credibility in the dialogue.
That's interesting because, if you ask the average consumer who's an average voter, it seems to resonate with them. And I have found that, with my employees at the time, coming from a predominant Republican territory, that, especially the younger generation, they're all voting age, obviously, because they're working for me. They just found it to be obstinate that they didn't have that conversation, and they just want to explore it because they know in their hearts it's just the right thing to do. Put it in the prisoner's dilemma. Any rational outcome is you should assume that we are having an influence and we should be doing something, and to turn a kind of a deaf ear to it just turns them off as well. So I'm really grateful for what you're doing. So maybe I could ask you, what could we be doing? This group that's on this call, they're influential business leaders, they're influential voices within the community. What are ways that we could actually help and be supportive to what you're trying to do with this caucus?
Excellent question. Let me first of all give all of you a shout out. To be honest, what helped me on my journey to getting more comfortable was watching the business community, watching all of you, acknowledge that the climate's changing and man's influencing it, and change your business practices accordingly. And if I'm honest with myself, you're all ahead of us, right, as government. Well, there's their buzzer in the background. I think, okay, my staff will let me know that we've been, for those of you that just joined, we didn't know if I was going to get called to votes. I don't think that necessarily means, I think that means they're opening up the House floor. So I'm okay for right now. The technology here in DC has not changed in 50 years. They still ring that crazy buzzer when they want our attention. But David, I think first of all, tell your stories. Tell us what you're doing. It's pretty amazing what all of you are doing, in your businesses, in your lives. And I think not just me, but our local politicians need to hear that story. Utah is moving in a great direction on this, but quite frankly, not fast enough. Just like we're not doing it fast enough here. And I think, conservative lawmakers need to hear from you that you support them, right? That you'll get their back, right? If you'll step out on this, we're there to get your back. You're not going to be out there all by yourselves. And I think your voices are just very, very powerful.
You know, I don't mean to speak for those on the call, but I will share with you just what you just said is true. I mean, there's an incredible war for talent right now. I mean, just a war that I've never seen before on trying to not only get enough people back into the workforce, but then the competition within it. And it is if we don't show to them that we are environmentally sensitive, that we have EV charging stations, that we actually have a green policy within the confines of our place, and we can outline for them that we're progressive on this front. I honestly think that 30 or 40% of our candidates don't view us as a progressive, forward-thinking company. It is absolutely in the psyche of our employees, and it's something that it's not. This is a bipartisan. This should be a bipartisan collective effort. So, anyways, really appreciate you doing that. While we still have you, we know you might have to go vote, a very important vote today, and your involvement's in critical. So I'll move on to the next question, and we'll take it for as long as we can. You know, you've done a lot of work on energy storage, including sponsoring some legislation to establish an investment tax credit for standalone energy storage systems for utilities. Why are you focused on energy storage, and what opportunities do you see in developing storage for Utah?
A great question. Listen, I don't think we can get where we need to go if we don't refine storage, right? We can have all the windmills, we have all the solar in the world, and if we don't learn how to store it, we've got a bottleneck and we can't really reach our goals. So that's the catch for me in storage is, look, we've got to invest some of our great minds there and incentivize them to spend some time on storage. And I actually believe Utah, this is exciting for Utah. Utah can lead out, and I hope Utah, right, is the state that takes full advantage of this, because we've got the minds, we've got the capital, we've got the ability to be literally a world leader. We have to be a little bit careful, because in some cases we give China a head start on this, and I want to make sure our businesses have a level playing field as they're competing across the globe. But I guarantee you, if you give our businesses in Utah a level playing field, we'll clean up on this. And it's such an important part of the eventual solution is to come up with storage. And I'm excited for the technologies that are out there, that are already out there, and those that will yet be developed.
That's great. You know, I had a third question, Josh and Sarah, but the Congressman, I actually kind of talked about this earlier in my first question. So just given that we may not have him for a long period of time, if it gets pulled off, perhaps we do go to some of the questions in the Q&As and include the group in this dialogue. So Josh, let me turn it over to you. You've been monitoring the chat group and kind of lead us into some questions for the Congressman.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Congressman. We have a few questions that have come into the chat, and folks, if you have others, please let me know. I'm gonna have Dr. Jeff Robeson, who serves on our board, ask his question. Jeff, if you're available to unmute yourself, just go ahead and ask.
Thanks, Congressman Curtis. I was in Provo when you were elected mayor, so and I'm certain you don't remember meeting me, but I've met you before. So thank you for taking the time. Sure. What I put in the chat is, how is it that we reconcile, and I know you've been thoughtful about this, the deliberate and at times slow pace that's needed to achieve political consensus around a solution to something, with what science is telling us is the immediacy of what is needed to avoid the worst consequences of climate change?
A couple of thoughts on this. First of all, I believe one of the problems that we have with this dialogue is we rarely stop to celebrate our accomplishments. So for just a minute, I mean, it feels like Washington's doing nothing, but last fall, we passed the largest bill ever for the environment. We agreed to reduce hydrofluorocarbons by 85%. If the rest of the world did the same thing, that's 2 degrees Celsius that would impact. So first of all, I think it's important that we do stop and acknowledge, right, while we all want to go quicker and faster, we have done some pretty remarkable things. And the Q45 investment a few years ago, and there is actually more consensus on this and more work that's being done than maybe we're just not really good at PR here in Washington. So I will tell you that I am proud of the work that was being done and totally agree more needs to be done. The second thing is I think that it's important when we talk about this, that we stick with the science that we know. And the science that we know is that, yes, we're in trouble. Yes, we need to make changes. But I think it turns people off when we make it more urgent than it actually is. So we hear sometimes, like, if we don't in 7 years, if we don't do something in 7 years, it's too late. Well, that's just not true. It gets worse, right? But it's not too late. And I think appealing to people's optimistic side sometimes, to me, is far more powerful than the pessimistic side. And sometimes we paint it as such a crisis that people throw up their arms and say, look, I don't even know what we're going to do about this. And maybe my last point is, and I tried to make this a little bit earlier, while there is a major and significant role for government, the real heroes in here are already solving the problem, right? And that's the private sector and business. And I really believe we should not discount the role that's underway and happening now in government. We need to catch up, right? We need to do it. I'm not suggesting at all we don't have our work cut out for us to do, but I actually think the people that are going to solve this are that we're talking to you right now and are all over the globe, actually.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to, Joby Bernstein from Wasatch Global Advisors. You have a question about carbon pricing, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Congressman Curtis, thank you again for taking the time to speak to us. Really awesome to see the efforts underway. I was just curious, I have an economics background, and economists for decades have kind of advocated for carbon pricing as sort of the most efficient way to shift the economy towards renewable sources. I'm just kind of curious your views and sort of the caucus's views, and why not support a carbon tax?
So, what's interesting is all of a sudden carbon tax has been thrown into the 3.5 reconciliation conversation. This all might be a moot point if that's thrown in there. They're talking about actually replacing all of their proposed taxes with that. So that'll be interesting to watch that and see. Listen, I know there are a lot of really credible people talking about this. Let me just bring up a couple concerns quickly that I have with it, which have kind of kept me on the sidelines. One is just the name itself. The carbon tax it's not, it's just dealing with one greenhouse gas emission. Methane, to me, is an increasingly concern and worry. And sometimes I think those who go to the carbon tax feel like, boy, if we just do that, then we're done. And the reality of it is we may be done with carbon, but we've got serious issues with methane and other greenhouse gas emissions. The other thing is, nobody's really shown me a formula yet that does deal with China in an adequate way. And how do we keep China from cheating? And then the last thing is that it still doesn't deals with a lot of carbon sources, but not all of them that we would import. So I'm not I like having a conversation about it. I like the people who are so passionate about it, but I think we've got to bring in and answer some of these questions.
Certainly have had a robust dialogue lately in here in Utah, Congressman, and you've been part of that for a while. I'm going to turn to Josh Brown of Rio Tinto to ask a question.
Hello,
Hey, Josh.
Hi, nice to see you. So the question I have, and I've spent a lot of time working with the utilities and the electrical utilities, and if anyone's on the call, they can also speak up. But Utah Clean Energy went through in one of their events, and they showed videos on microgrids and how communities in rural areas are creating their own kind of personal energy independence from solar that can be shared between neighbors and in battery storage. And it seems like an awesome opportunity for us here in the US to be able to, perfect world, have solar on my house when batteries are appropriate, create my own storage and create these micro community grids where we can share power back and forth, as well as, lower the carbon footprint. Then you look at it from the utility side, and, their models, the way that they make their revenue is based off of recouping fixed costs from assets, still in the ground, as well as, they're looking at renewable sources as well. And I'm just trying to figure out, how do we create that balance where, it's not viewed as an attack to put utilities out of business, but create a different alternative, because I think it would help, foster technical growth, changes in technology in these arenas if there were more avenues where people could actively participate. I don't know if there's an answer. I'm just kind of making that statement.
It's a great question, and I've watched it closely. David's watched it closely, right? I mean, it impacts a lot of industry in Utah. One of the things I'd throw out there, having been the mayor of Provo and a municipal power city, that I think is important to acknowledge if we're going to have a thoughtful conversation with the utilities, is and at least it was to me, I can't speak for PacifiCorp and other utilities, I can just speak for me as the mayor of Provo, is the fear that as fewer and fewer people become less dependent on the grid, that more and more people will be bearing the burden of the grid, right? So the grid, over the next, if we're going to do with EVs, what we want to do with EVs, the grid has to become far more resilient and has to be far larger than it is right now. But as we develop the ability for people to be independent of the grid, that means you're not paying that slice of the grid with your utility bill, right? Everybody, whether they know it or not, is paying for part of that grid when they pay their utility bill. So I think if we could get them to lower their defenses a little bit, I think that's what you were asking, right? Like, how do we get them to have more of a thoughtful conversation? So I think acknowledging that going in and really realizing that for society, this grid is going to be an important role. How do we pay for that grid, right? As people become independent from that grid, I think it's very important.
Right.
It's interesting. I liked having Provo Power because we were a monopoly, right? Like, I kind of like that. Got used to being a monopoly, right? And I think that's part of the problem too, is the paradigm shift of, like, you can only get your power from me, is a huge paradigm shift that utilities need to start coming to terms with. The world is going to be so, and it's fast. The change is fast, right? The world for utilities is going to be so different in a few years than it is from now. And yet, and PacifiCorp is a really good example, we're asking them to go invest in nuclear. We're asking them to go invest in, right, all of these technologies. They need this certain future at the same time. And so I think these worlds collide. And just acknowledging that, I think, Josh, is a really good way to begin that conversation with them.
Thank you. And as an FYI, we always called those people left by the wayside as we're going to increase Mrs. Merkowitz's bill.
Yeah.
Stuck in my head.
Yeah, exactly. Good.
Let's see. Soren Simonson has asked a question. And Soren, I'll let you unmute. I know you're on the phone.
Okay, I'm unmuted now. Thank you. I'm out in the field. I apologize for the shaky phone, and hopefully it's not too unstable. Congressman Curtis, I appreciate the great work you're doing and love the effort behind this new caucus. I am curious why many, or maybe most of the members of the caucus opposed the recent methane rule that passed. It had strong bipartisan support and was broadly supported by the industries that it would have regulated. I'm glad that it passed because it will do a lot for Utah. But what's the purpose of a caucus looking for pragmatic and conservative climate solutions? In other words, those that are supported by business, if it opposes this kind of legislation?
So, Soren, first of all, how are you? Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I'm gonna join you in your concern about methane. As a matter of fact, my deputy chief, we have 2 or 3 conversations a day lately saying, look, we need a methane. We need to say what we do support, right? Because it's one thing to just say we don't support this. So what is it with methane that we support? And I hope in the upcoming weeks to be introducing some methane legislation of my own. At heart is the problem that government regulation. Sorry for that really obnoxious buzzer. At heart, government regulation has a disproportionate impact on the smaller guys. And it was a feeling that while the larger corporations said, yeah, we can deal with this methane bill, we would have put the smaller guys out of business. And so what we're looking for in methane regulation is a combination of a carrot and a stick. And we've got our smaller guys who can't afford to buy the technology to capture this methane. it's incumbent on us to figure out how to work with them to find resources for them to do that. Methane is an interesting thing. It's their own product that they're letting escape into the atmosphere. They don't want that to happen. And so to answer your question, I'd love to have you ask me that in 6 months and rephrase that and say, okay, have you found the right methane bill that you can support? Because that's my goal, and absolutely agree that we've got to deal with methane.
Congressman, I think we could, how are you on time? We have 2 more questions, but I also don't want to keep you.
Let's jump in and try one. I told my staff, come pull me out of here when I've got 10 minutes before they close the vote. So when that door opens, I'll close rather quickly, but let's try another one.
Okay. Jack Hedge has a question about zero emissions vehicles. Jack.
Congressman Curtis, thanks for taking the time today to do this. I'm Jack Hedge. I'm the Executive Director of the Utah Inland Port Authority. One of the things that we're seeing in trend in logistics is a move toward the need to decarbonize the supply chain, decarbonize logistics. It's a mandate coming from cargo owners and their customers, and yet there's resistance on a couple of levels. Number one, the vehicles are much more expensive today than conventional vehicles, and also the infrastructure is lacking in a lot of places, a lot of gaps. Entities like the Port Authority can address the infrastructure side of things, but is there an appetite in Washington to support that cost differential through some mechanism of the difference in the price between advanced fuel vehicles and conventional vehicles?
There is, but you bring up infrastructure, and let me just tell you, like right now, if all of you were wildly successful in outfitting with electric vehicles, we couldn't charge them, right? Even if we built the charging stations around the country, we couldn't supply the power to charge them. And I think this is one really important example where I think one of the things we're missing as a country and really as a world is a broad strategy that works together, right? We've got all of these like initiatives on climate, and we're going to do this one over here, and we're going to do this one together, but rarely is somebody saying, how does that fit in to the much larger picture of the climate? Sometimes we forget what the goal is. The goal is not electric vehicles. The goal is not to get rid of fossil fuels. The goal is to reduce worldwide greenhouse gas emissions, right? And I think too often we're not like holding our efforts up to that goal to say, is it leading us there? And if we go spend a bunch of money in this category, A, will it move the needle? And B, will it complement the whole picture, right, that we're moving on? And this is a really good example where, like, we still don't know where all the materials are going to come from to build these batteries, right, and let alone charge them. And so that's kind of what I'm trying to ask back here in Washington, D.C. is like questions like that. The short version is, yes, there's an appetite to help and assist and incentivize along that way, but I'm hoping we do so in a thoughtful way. We only have so many dollars we can incentivize with, right? We want to make sure we're actually putting them where we want the ball to move to. Josh, we're good with another.
All right. Our colleague of ours, Professor Rob Davies, has a question, and I'm going to allow him to unmute and ask it.
Hello, Congressman Curtis, and thank you for taking this time. So first of all, I greatly appreciate your sharing and your candidness about your journey in becoming aware of this problem. I've heard you speak a number of times on this topic, and each time I hear you've come a little further. And so at the risk of being rude, I'm going to try to bring us a little further again. I heard you mention that your colleagues are often, reluctant or turned off by what they consider to be extreme. And I did just hear you say a little while ago that you felt that overstating the problem was a turnoff and could be counterproductive. And I do understand that sentiment. So I'm a physicist and I've been working in this field for the last 15 years. And I think when I say this, I'm not speaking for myself, but this is just what's coming from the very large scientific community. I know that you're aware that is working on this, that it is almost impossible to overstate the level of urgency and risk that we are facing. And I heard you use the term 7 years a little while ago. But it is in fact true that we cannot win this battle in the next 7 years or decade, but we can go a long way towards losing it in that time. And that's not tinfoil hat, that's not Chicken Little, that's just the physics. And so I guess what I want to ask is, the notion of what is viable and what is extreme, of course, is relative to the risks that we perceive. And I'm wondering, I guess the challenge with policymakers, in my view, is we're trying to get you all to understand the scale of risk in the very tight window. And I understand you work in this world where the consensus building and all of that can be very difficult. But of course, we know that when we perceive risk and it's big, we can turn on a dime. And I think most recently, the very quick and large reactions to COVID are example to that. And there are many examples in our history. Oftentimes World War II is brought up as an example. So I'm just here to try to say, I appreciate the notion of extreme, but I would simply ask that how do you respond to the notion that extreme risks warrant extreme responses? And this is not coming from a position of but being rational about the topic. And perhaps maybe the better
maybe we can let
rationally,
the Congressman respond.
rationally passionate.
Thanks, Robert. You've asked a tough question in the kindest way I could possibly think possible. So thank you. Let me try to maybe better help you understand my head and maybe that of my colleagues. Oftentimes we hear, look, if we don't do this, something terrible is going to happen. And it's just not a motivator. Let me give you a really good example. COVID, you brought up COVID. Our college kids knew that if they joined together with all their friends on a beach, that they radically increased the likelihood that they would get COVID. It didn't stop them, right, from gathering on beaches. And I think as much as those of you with this great knowledge and this great experience want us all to be motivated by that, I don't find it to be a good motivator for change. And I think that's one of the reasons that I'm not as receptive maybe as sometimes people would like me to be. And I think now let me layer in another component of that and say, so let's suppose hypothetically that we say, look, we have to change this by 7 years. We have, not just a little bit, we have to radically change our livelihood, what we eat, the way we transport ourselves, the way we live, all of that in the next 7 years. And we get wildly successful and we take US emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, let's say to near zero in 7 years. I mean, our wildest dreams, right? Like we're near zero in 7 years. And then we turn our head to China and India and Russia. And I think this is why you feel pushback from us on the Paris Accord, is you say, well, wait a minute, the Paris Accord allows China to increase their emissions for the next 20 years. So if we're going to make these kind of sacrifices, and if we're going to make these radical changes to our lives, and it's not going to move the needle, I got a problem, right? I mean, that's going to give, I want to push back on that. And I think too often part of the dialogue doesn't take into account the goal. The goal, and I think you'd agree with me on this, is to reduce worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And anything short of that, we will fail. And so I think that's why some of these ideas seem extreme, because they just feel like, wow, you're going to ask me to do this. And then if I follow the science, which you're asking me to follow, it's not going to take us there. And let me give you a really good example. Natural gas, I think, is a really good example where there are those who feel like, look, we can't use natural gas because it emits greenhouse gas emissions, right? Well, look, I could use natural gas, US natural gas, and reduce more greenhouse gas emissions in China by replacing their coal with US natural gas. I could even replace Russia natural gas with our natural gas and do more to reduce greenhouse gas emissions than the entire Green New Deal. And so I think a lot of us just want that degree of practicality. It moved into the discussion, and we bristle a little bit because I don't think it motivates, and it's not just Republicans. I just think generally it just doesn't motivate people. And B, I think when we don't get, when our internal clocks, even though we're not, we're not scientists, we're not experts on this, but when our internal clock says, wait a minute, I can't see that, I can't fathom that if we do this here in the United States, or if we don't do this in the United States and we still allow China to do what they're doing, that's going to make a difference. So I think part of the practicality I'm trying to bring to the discussion is, yes, you know what, you are right, and your scientific friends are absolutely right. It took me a while to be able to say that, right? Like that's actually a bigger deal than I think everybody realizes, right? And my colleagues are starting to say that. Yeah, right. Let's enjoy that moment, right? For just a moment, and then let's come together and be really absolutely practical. Follow the exact science, right, about what will happen. To be truthful, we're not talking enough about mitigation. Like, okay, I'm gonna join you and do all I can in the next 7 years, but we're gonna come up short, and sea levels are gonna rise, and where we plant crops in some places, we're not gonna be able to plant crops. I think we need to be spending more time, and that's, I think, where you can help us see what does that look like, right? What's going to be happening to us. And that to me is a little bit more motivating. And then the reality of it is, the way I've motivated most Republicans and conservatives on this is to appeal to what I believe their God-given intuitive nature of a responsibility to take care of the earth and to leave it better than we found it. And I find that highly motivating with a lot of people that I talk to. And by showing them we're not doing that and how they can do that better, I've actually been able to move more, get more action out of people than anything else. But I'd love to keep talking to you about that. And I do greatly respect your expertise on that. And I don't want to discount that as I talk about this.
Not at all. Thank you, Congressman. And I'm going to turn over, before I turn it back to David, I'm going to turn to my boss, Sarah Wright, for our final question. And then we can move to close. Sarah.
So I guess, do we have time for a question? Are you sure?
We're good. Yeah, they haven't. When you see that hook come in, then okay. I'm going to leave quickly, but we're good.
That's great. So one of the questions that I have is that, as we transition, many of our rural communities that have relied on an energy economy and also part of their identity and family identity for years back, what do you suggest we do to help our rural communities?
I love the question. I tell people back here, I represent a county called Carbon County. What do you suppose they do in Carbon County, right? And I think a couple of things. Let's start with putting an end to demonizing them, right? They feel demonized. They feel like the world is after them. And if you look at some of the comments from colleagues here in DC, you'll see what I'm talking about, this demonization, not just of coal, not just of extraction, but of the actual people who have been involved in this. And the reality of it is, we owe them, the Industrial Revolution was accomplished on their backs. These are people who risked their health, who risked their safety, so that we could flip a switch and have 70 degrees or have a light come on. So that's my very first suggestion, is that we give them a little bit more respect in the conversation. When I talk with them, that's what most of them want. They don't want handouts, right? They're hardworking, good people that they just want a little bit of respect. The second thing is, we need to listen to them. We're too quick back here to say, look, we want to come help you. We're going to teach you how to code. Well, they don't want to know how to code, or some of them don't want to know how to code. And I think we need to ask them what they need, right? Be more in tune with what is it that they want help with. Just as a real quick example, the coal-fired power plant on the Navajo reservation closed early. The Hopi Indians provided coal to that. When we closed that reservation, we cut off 80% of that tribe's revenue. 80% of an already somewhat impoverished Indian tribe's revenue went away in a second, right? Well, can we make that transition just a little bit slower, right? Like, okay, yeah, we got to close the plant. I get that, but that transition is brutal, right? And giving people more of a time to transition. These are bright, thoughtful people. They'll figure it out. But I think our timeline is also something that we need to take into consideration. Those are just a couple of thoughts off the top of my head.
Thank you, Congressman. I'm going to turn it back over to David. Close this out.
Congressman, we appreciate your time. We appreciate all the attendees for your questions, your participation. I'll just close with this. I became an accidental activist in this world. I was asked to do a job, and then I fell in love with the cause of what we're trying to do here, which is grow the economy and do it and also protect the earth. I think just for everyone on this call, whether, wherever you fall upon the political spectrum, whether you're red or blue or independent in between, I think we all need to become an intentional activist. I think we've got an ally here with Congressman Curtis. I think we need to engage with all of the folks that he's trying to persuade, and we need to advance this conversation. We're not going to find an answer, pragmatic or not pragmatic. We're not going to find the right answer unless we engage. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, Congressman, the voice of the business community carries a very large voice. And we all need to make sure that we are actively voicing that and actively collaborating. So we appreciate your partnership in doing that, and wish you all the best.
Thanks to all of you. Great to be with you. Let's do it again.
Take care.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you, Congressman.